What would you do if your own daughter kicked you out of her home? Not with a scream, but with silence, called you an extra mouth to feed, and let her husband humiliate you at the dinner table. Would you cry, would you beg, or would you quietly disappear, only to return with a deed in your hand and their future in yours? This is not just a story, it's a reckoning. A story about power, about silence, about a mother who was discarded and came back as a storm they never saw coming. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, erased, this story is for you. Hit subscribe for more life-changing stories, undercover CEO drama, and emotional true story narrations. Comment where you're watching from and turn on the bell, because the truth has a voice and it's whispering louder than ever. They say family is where love never runs out, where you're always welcome no matter how far you fall, how hard life hits you, or how long it takes you to find your way back. I believed that. I believed it with my whole heart, until the day I found myself standing outside my daughter's apartment building, clutching 2 old suitcases and realizing there was no one left to call. My name is Margaret. I'm 58. And for most of my life, I believed in something I thought was unbreakable, something I called unconditional love. I didn't grow up with much, but I knew how to give everything I had to the people I loved, and I gave it all. My time, my energy, my youth, my dreams, my heart. I married young. We weren't rich, but we had each other, and we had Amanda, our daughter, the light in our lives. Every sacrifice I made, every holiday I organized, every dollar I tucked away in savings was for her, so she could have more than I did, so she would never have to wonder if she was loved. My husband passed last year after a long and brutal fight with cancer, the kind that doesn't just take the body but strips away the spirit in slow, aching pieces. I held his hand through every treatment, every sleepless night, every tear he tried to hide. And when he was gone, it felt like the floor dropped out from under me. But I told myself I still had Amanda. I told myself love was still there, that she would never let me fall all the way down. So I made the hardest choice of my life. I sold our house, the one we built from nothing in Cedar Park just north of Austin, a home filled with memories, filled with the sound of laughter, with the smell of Sunday dinners, filled with his voice calling my name from the kitchen. I sold it because I couldn't stay there, because the silence inside those walls was louder than any storm. And when Amanda said I could stay with her and Chad for a while, I said yes, because I thought it would be healing. I thought it would be love. I thought it would be family. But what I walked into was something else entirely. Chad barely looked up when I arrived. Amanda smiled, offered me tea, but Chad kept his eyes on his phone, his expression unreadable, cold. They gave me a small room in the back of the apartment, no windows, but I didn't complain. I told myself I was lucky. I told myself it was temporary. I tried to make myself invisible. I cleaned, I cooked, I offered to run errands. I asked if I could help with bills even though I had no income yet. I just wanted to be helpful, to not be a burden. But Chad, he made me feel like a ghost in my own daughter's home. The way his eyes flicked past me, the way he sighed when I spoke. Like every word I said cost him something he wasn't willing to give. At first I thought I was imagining it. I told myself he was just tired, but then the little things piled up. He rolled his eyes. If I asked how his day was, he'd change the channel when I was halfway through a show. Once I heard him walk past me and mutter the word freeloader under his breath, it sliced through me like paper on skin. Quiet but sharp. I tried to pretend I hadn't heard. I tried to smile through it. I looked to Amanda, hoping for a word, a glance, some kind of signal that she saw what was happening, but she would just shrug, say he was stressed, say work was hard, say not to take it personally. And I wanted to believe her. I really did, because the alternative was too painful to accept. So I stayed silent. I swallowed every bit of shame like bitter tea. I reminded myself that mothers are supposed to be strong, that we don't get to fall apart, that we just keep loving even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. I convinced myself that my presence was still a gift, that I was still needed, still wanted, even if no one said it out loud. But deep down, something inside me had already begun to crack, not loudly, not dramatically, but like hairline fractures. You don't notice until one day the whole thing shatters. I didn't know it yet, but that day was coming, and it was closer than I could have imagined. Because no matter how quietly you live, no matter how much love you give, there are some people who will always see you as nothing more than an extra mouth to feed, and some daughters who will choose silence over loyalty, comfort over courage. And when they do, it doesn't come with a warning. It comes with a knife wrapped in a smile. And I was about to learn that the hard way. It happened on a Tuesday evening, the kind of quiet night where nothing seems out of place, where the world hums gently in the background, like everything's fine, like everything's normal. I had made dinner just like I always did. I used the last of the frozen peas and leftover chicken to make Chad's favorite. Chicken pot pie, golden crust, warm filling, seasoned just right. It wasn't much, but it was something that still made me feel useful, something that made me feel like a mother again. I set the table while Amanda scrolled on her phone, her fingers tapping the screen like she was somewhere else entirely. Chad cracked open a beer without saying a word. The television buzzed softly in the background. The silence between us felt thick, like fog you could choke on. I smiled through it, told myself to be patient, that maybe tonight would feel like home again. We sat down to eat. I passed the dishes with quiet care, tried to make light conversation, asked Chad how work was going. He didn't answer, just grunted and shoveled food onto his plate. Amanda didn't look up, and I reminded myself for the 100th time not to take it personally. Just keep eating, just keep breathing, just keep hoping. And then, out of nowhere, Chad looked up from his plate and said the words that would split my world open. "You know," he said, slow like he'd been rehearsing it in his head. "Maybe it's time we stop pretending this is temporary. We're not a charity." I blinked, unsure if I heard him right. Amanda froze mid-scroll, her thumb hovering above the screen. I looked at Chad and whispered, "What do you mean?" He leaned back in his chair, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and smirked the kind of smirk that says he's been waiting to say this for a while. "I mean," he said, "how long is this supposed to go on? You're not working, you're not contributing. We've got bills to pay. We didn't sign up for extra mouths to feed." The words hit like a slap I never saw coming. My fork paused mid-air, my breath caught in my chest. I turned to Amanda, desperate for a signal, a word, a look that said this wasn't real, this wasn't happening, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. She just stared at the table, then mumbled, "Maybe it's best, if you found something more stable for everyone's sake." Everyone's sake, she said it like I was a storm they had to survive. Like I was the problem they didn't want to deal with anymore. Like I was a burden I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't throw the plate across the room like part of me wanted to. I just stood up, slowly, carefully, like my body knew that if I moved too fast, I might break apart entirely. I walked to my room without saying a word, pulled out the 2 suitcases I had brought with me, started folding clothes, every shirt, every sock, every photo I had brought with me that reminded me of who I used to be. The tears didn't come right away. They came in small waves that I swallowed down because I didn't want them to hear me break. I zipped up the bags and stood by the door, waiting, half hoping Amanda would come down the hall, would knock gently, would whisper that she didn't mean it, that she was sorry. But the hallway stayed silent, like they had already erased me. No one offered to help carry my bags. No one asked where I would go. No one even opened the door for me. I walked out alone, the wind biting through my thin coat, dragging my suitcases down the steps of the building I had cleaned, cooked in, tried to turn into something resembling family. I sat on the curb for nearly an hour, my phone dead in my purse, my hands trembling from more than the cold. Cars passed, people laughed in the distance, and I sat there with everything I owned in 2 bags and a heart that felt like it had just been torn out. That was the moment I realized what it meant to be erased, Not yelled at, not disowned, just quietly removed, like I had never mattered, like I was an extra mouth they couldn't feed. I checked into the cheapest motel I could find, the kind of place where the wallpaper peels at the corners and the lights flicker. If you breathe too hard, I lay on the stiff bed that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything could collapse so quickly, wondering how love could turn so quiet and so cruel. And in that silence, I made a decision, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of something deeper, something ancient, something fierce. They had thrown me out thinking I was done, but I wasn't finished, not even close. The motel room smelled like dust and disappointment, the kind of place where dreams came to die quietly behind thin doors and stained curtains. I dropped my suitcases by the bed, sat down without taking off my coat, and stared at the wall like it might offer answers, like it might whisper that this was all just a misunderstanding, that Amanda would call, that this wasn't how it ends. But the silence pressed harder than anything Chad had ever said. The hum of the vending machine outside my door was the only sound in that hollow space. The soda inside clinking like bones, rattling in a forgotten graveyard. And I lay back on the scratchy blanket fully clothed, afraid that if I let myself get comfortable, I might start to believe I belonged there. That first night, I didn't sleep. I didn't cry either, not yet. Instead, I stared at the ceiling and replayed every second of that dinner, every word, every silence, every moment Amanda could have stood up for me and chose not to. I thought about texting her, but my phone was dead, and so was my hope. The next morning, I charged my phone at the front desk using an old cord I found in my purse. I sent Amanda a message, short, careful, "I understand. I love you always." Then I waited. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. No reply. Hours passed, then days, still nothing. So I sent another, then another. Birthdays came and went. Silence stretched longer than I thought possible. I walked to the nearby library and used their computer to apply for jobs. Anything, really. I wasn't picky. I just needed to feel useful again, needed something to pay for food, for shelter, for a sliver of dignity. But no one wanted a grieving widow in her late 50s with no recent work history and a look in her eyes that said she'd already lost everything that mattered. I tried babysitting, cleaning houses, handing out flyers, but my knees ached when I climbed stairs. My hands trembled when I scrubbed for too long. My back seized up when I bent over too quickly. The world moves fast for women like me, and when we fall behind, it rarely offers a hand. Some nights, I ate ramen noodles and stale crackers. Other nights, I skipped dinner altogether just to stretch the little I had left. I told myself this was temporary, that I'd get back on my feet soon, but as weeks turned into months, that promise felt more like a lie I told to survive. I sat in that motel room staring at the walls more than I care to admit. The wallpaper peeled like old skin. The light bulb flickered like it couldn't decide if I deserved brightness or not. The bed creaked like it was tired of holding broken women. And every night I curled into myself, trying not to let the silence devour me. The loneliness was the worst part, worse than the hunger, worse than the shame. It wrapped around me like a second skin, a heavy cloak I couldn't shrug off. I tried smiling at people at the gas station, the laundromat, the corner store, but my smiles rarely made it past my lips. I was invisible, not just to Amanda, but to the whole world. And yet, even in that emptiness, I kept reaching out to her, a message here, a heart emoji there, just little reminders that I hadn't disappeared, that I was still her mother, still waiting for her to remember what love used to feel like, but the replies never came. One night, I pulled out a small box I had packed without thinking, a dusty collection of old letters, birthday cards, faded photos, pieces of the life I used to have. At the very bottom, beneath a tangle of ribbons and wrinkled receipts, was something I hadn't seen in decades. My mother's diary, bound in worn leather, corners bent, the smell of time clinging to its pages. I didn't remember packing it. I didn't even remember the last time I opened it, but something about the weight of it in my hands made me sit down on the edge of the bed and flip it open. Her handwriting was just as I remembered, loopy, neat, soft ink strokes that somehow still carried her voice. At first it was mundane, weather complaints, grocery lists, notes about church picnics, and neighborhood gossip. But then something shifted. The tone darkened, the words trembled, and suddenly it wasn't just a diary, it was a confession, a secret, a story I was never meant to find. She wrote about a man, about love that wasn't allowed, about a promise made in shadows. And as I read on, my heart began to race, because I wasn't just reading about her, I was reading about me. And in that moment, for the first time in months, I didn't feel lost. I didn't feel erased. I felt like I had stumbled onto something powerful, something buried, something that might just change everything. Because maybe I wasn't just a discarded mother with 2 suitcases and nowhere to go. Maybe I was more than they ever knew. I sat cross-legged on the edge of that motel bed, holding my mother's diary like it was the only anchor left in a world that had quietly let me drown. The leather was cracked at the spine, its pages worn thin at the edges like they'd been touched by time and secrecy. I don't know why I opened it that night. Maybe I just needed to hear a voice other than my own echoing back at me. Maybe I wanted to remember what it felt like to matter to someone. At first, it was exactly what I expected. Little entries about the weather, about Sunday service and Miss Edith's burnt casserole at last week's potluck. Entries about grocery prices rising again and how the neighbor's dog wouldn't stop barking. I smiled at those lines, small moments of a simpler time, my mother's voice drifting back to me in ink and memory. But then the tone shifted. The handwriting didn't change, but the weight behind the words did. Her sentences began to tremble between the lines, like she was writing things down that she was afraid to even think out loud. Then came an entry dated June, written in the softest pen, almost like a whisper on paper. "He came again today," she wrote. "He said he wished things were different, said he wished I could be his wife. But he has a family, a business, a name to protect. Margaret must never know. She must never know." I stopped breathing for a second, my fingers frozen over the words, reading them again and again. My name. She had written my name. "I just pray," she continued, "that one day she understands how much I loved her, even if she was born out of mistake and desire." My hands trembled as I turned the pages, each one revealing more fragments of a life I didn't know I was living. Late-night meetings in dim hotels, small envelopes of cash she tried to refuse, his promises and her guilt, her hope and his silence. His initials were there too, HJS, written in soft cursive, again and again, like she couldn't stop herself. But then I found the page that would change everything, dated February, short and final. He said he made arrangements that if anything ever happened to him, he would ensure Margaret had something, a part of what he built, not officially, of course, too dangerous. But he promised me a trust, a letter. He said his lawyer, Mr. Goldstein, would know. That name, Goldstein, I must remember it. My heart was pounding in my chest like it was trying to claw its way out, because I knew that name. I had seen it before, once, on a letterhead when I was helping organize my husband's estate. It was the name of a man who had handled legacies and inheritances for decades, a name that suddenly meant everything. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the small window of the motel room watching headlights blur past in streaks of gold, holding that diary to my chest like it was a key, and I was standing in front of a door I never knew existed. The next morning, I took a deep breath and walked to the library again, the same one where I had searched for jobs that never came. This time, I searched for Leonard Goldstein, a state attorney, retired but still listed with a small private firm in Dallas. I didn't call him. I couldn't. My hands were shaking too badly. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in years. I wrote a letter by hand, careful, vulnerable, explaining who I was, who my mother was, what I had found, and asking, begging really, for a conversation, for confirmation, for anything. 2 weeks passed before the phone rang in my motel room, the old plastic receiver buzzing against my ear as I lifted it with trembling fingers. His voice was soft, older, but full of something I couldn't quite name. When I told him my mother's name, there was a long pause, then a quiet exhale. "I always wondered if you'd reach out someday," he said. "There's something you need to see." The next morning, I boarded a Greyhound to Dallas with nothing but a half-packed suitcase and a prayer. I had no idea what was waiting for me, no idea if I was being scammed or played or just delusional. But I had to know. I had to see. When I stepped into his office, everything smelled like old books and dust, the air heavy with the weight of secrets. He handed me a sealed envelope, yellowed and delicate, with my name written on it in handwriting I didn't recognize but somehow already trusted to my daughter, Margaret Louise. I read the first paragraph, then the second, then broke into tears I hadn't cried in months, real tears, full of grief and validation and the kind of aching relief that makes you feel both whole and broken at the same time. He admitted everything: the affair, the regret, the years of silence, the promises he couldn't keep while he was alive but vowed to fulfill in death. And then, the words I never imagined I'd hear: "You are my blood, and though I was too much a coward to claim you in life, I claim you now in death." Goldstein slid a folder across the desk. I opened it slowly. Inside were account numbers, trust documents, ownership papers, investment breakdowns, the total value just over $1 million. I looked up at him and whispered the only words I could find: "This is real." He nodded gently. "It's always been yours." And in that moment, everything changed, not because of the money, but because for the first time in my life, I felt seen. I felt chosen. I felt like someone had believed I was worth something after all. I didn't go back to Austin right away. I could have. I had the means now. I had a bank account with more zeros than I ever thought I'd see. But something in me had changed too deeply to return to the same city as the same woman. Because I wasn't her anymore. I wasn't just Margaret, the forgotten mother in a borrowed room. I wasn't the silent guest who walked on eggshells to avoid another sigh from a man who never saw me. I was someone new now, someone made of truth and fire and quiet revelation, someone who had been lied to for a lifetime and finally knew who she really was. So I stayed in Dallas for a little while longer, not to celebrate, but to breathe. To walk slowly through neighborhoods I didn't know, sip coffee in quiet cafes, watch people live lives untouched by betrayal. I didn't envy them, not anymore. I studied them, the way they moved, the way they smiled. I wondered who among them had once been erased like I was, who had clawed their way back without a sound. Leonard Goldstein didn't just give me the inheritance. He gave me time. He gave me stillness. He gave me space to rediscover the silence inside myself and turn it into something powerful. Every morning, I woke up and asked myself one question: now that you know the truth, what will you do with it? Not out of anger, not for revenge, but because I finally had a choice. And that alone was a kind of freedom I had never known. I checked into a short-term rental just off South Congress when I returned to Austin. Not the kind of place Amanda and Chad would ever imagine me staying in. It was clean, minimal, modern, the kind of space where the world felt wide open, where the air didn't smell like someone else's resentment. I began to dress differently, not flashy, not loud, but intentional, polished, neutral tones that didn't scream for attention but demanded respect. I wore my hair differently too, pulled back, sharp lines, small earrings, a steady gaze in the mirror that told me this version of me didn't flinch anymore. I wasn't hiding, I was observing, moving through the world, invisible in a new way. Not because I was unwanted, but because I chose it. I started watching YouTube videos about investing, about real estate, about business structures, and LLCs and rental contracts. Not because I wanted to be rich or powerful, but because I wanted to understand the world that once left me behind. I wanted to be the kind of woman no one could ever ignore again. It wasn't about building an empire. It was about building armor. It was about never having to rely on anyone else to open a door for me again. I would learn to build the keys myself. Every night I studied. Every morning I took notes. I signed up for free webinars, downloaded PDFs, read legal articles I barely understood until I read them again and again, and they started to make sense. I was becoming fluent in a language that once made me feel small, and now it made me feel like I belonged in rooms I had never dared to enter. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, not Amanda, not Chad, not even the motel clerk who had smiled at me when I checked out that morning and left without saying goodbye. I was building something in silence, something that would protect me, something that would give me choices, and maybe, one day, something that would give me peace. The more I learned, the more I realized how easy it is to disappear in plain sight, and how powerful that can be if you're the one pulling the strings. I began sketching out a plan, not a grand scheme or a vendetta, but a blueprint for safety, for sovereignty. I started researching properties, investment opportunities, tax auctions. I learned about distressed assets and lien sales, about off-market listings and property flips. And then, one day, while scrolling through a quiet little real estate site buried under government links and outdated blogs, I saw it. An apartment complex in East Austin Small, a little rundown, structurally sound listed as distressed auction in 2 weeks, and the address, it was theirs. The building where Amanda and Chad lived, the same building where I had stood on the sidewalk with 2 suitcases and no place to go. I stared at the listing for a long time, my heart pounding softly but steadily, like a drum in the distance. This wasn't fate. This wasn't coincidence. This was a door, and I had the key now. With Mr. Goldstein's help, I formed an anonymous LLC, filed all the paperwork quietly, legally, perfectly clean. The name meant nothing to anyone but me. ML Holdings, Margaret Louise, the woman they thought they erased. I transferred the funds and submitted the bid without hesitation. Not for revenge, not to make them suffer, but to reclaim the space where I had been made to feel small. To stand in the one place where I had been thrown away and know that this time I was the one holding the deed. The auction came and went like a whisper. No grand announcement, no celebration, no one knew my name, no one saw my face, just a line of paperwork filed through an anonymous LLC with the kind of silence that speaks louder than thunder if you know where to listen. I watched it all unfold from a laptop screen in my rental apartment, fingers still trembling even though I knew what I was doing. Even though I had studied this moment 100 times in my head, I refreshed the auction page again and again until I saw the status change, sold to ML Holdings, to me. The same building where I had been humiliated, ignored, pushed out like I was some forgotten suitcase of old clothes, now belonged to me. Not to Chad, not to Amanda, not to the landlord who ignored every maintenance request I used to help submit, but to me. I sat back in my chair, letting the quiet settle in around me like a new skin. It wasn't revenge I felt, not exactly. It was something colder, deeper, something that hummed inside me like a steady current. This wasn't about punishing anyone. This was about owning the space where I was made to feel worthless and making sure no one could ever do that to me again. I didn't tell anyone. Not even Goldstein knew the full story. I kept the details close like a secret. I wasn't ready to speak out loud. I wanted to see what would happen when the truth started seeping in on its own, when the ones who discarded me realized the ground beneath their feet was no longer theirs. A month after the sale closed, I sent notification letters to all tenants, routine updates, nothing alarming, lease reviews, new management contact, nothing out of place, except one detail: rents would be reassessed based on current market value. For most tenants, that meant a modest increase. For Chad and Amanda, it meant triple the rent. triple the discomfort, triple the consequence of a moment at the dinner table they thought would fade into the past. I sat in silence, waiting for the reaction. I didn't need to be there to hear Chad explode. I knew him too well. I could picture the way he would pace in the living room, yelling at the walls, at Amanda, at the email, blaming the property manager, the city, the universe, everyone but himself. Amanda tried calling me 2 days later. I let it go to voicemail. "Mom," her voice cracked slightly. "I don't know if you've heard, but something weird is going on. Our rent just shot up. Like a lot. Chad's losing it. I don't know. Can we talk?" I didn't call back, because this wasn't about talking. This was about truth, about the weight of a choice, finally coming home to rest. I drove by the building one evening just once, late at night, headlights off, parked across the street. Their window lights were on. I saw shadows pacing inside. Chad's silhouette, Amanda's small frame moving behind him like a ghost of herself. I didn't stay long, just enough to remind myself that this wasn't vengeance. It was clarity. They needed to feel the silence they left me in. They needed to learn that actions have echoes, and sometimes those echoes return not with shouting, but with rent notices and LLC letterheads. Amanda kept calling, her messages softer each time, more confused than angry, more lost than apologetic. But I didn't answer, because this wasn't about repairing yet. This was about letting the fracture sit, letting the cracks show them who they had become. I began managing the property discreetly, hired a local management firm, made subtle repairs, updated signage, installed security cameras, replaced flickering hallway lights, painted over old stains they never noticed. I did it all quietly. The funds came from the rent they now paid, and that was the irony. Their punishment was financing everyone else's comfort. Every light fixed, every door reinforced, every flower planted outside the building came from the very wallet that once complained about feeding an extra mouth. Chad started sending messages through the tenant portal, vague threats, demands, confusion, irritation. He wanted answers. He wanted to know who was behind ML Holdings. He wanted to see a face, but I stayed in the shadows. Because the most powerful position isn't the one that screams, it's the one that watches and waits. And when Amanda walked past me in the parking lot one day and didn't even recognize me, that's when I knew the old version of me was truly gone. The woman she saw was just another figure in sunglasses and sleek clothes and calm footsteps. Not the mother who begged to stay, not the woman who carried her childhood in both hands and asked only for shelter. No, that woman no longer existed, and in her place was someone you couldn't evict because she already owned the key. The letters had been sent for weeks now, and I could feel the aftermath like a storm spreading across the surface of still water. Quiet at first, then growing louder under the surface. I didn't need to check the tenant portal to know Chad was unraveling. I could feel it in my bones the way you can sense rain before it falls. His ego couldn't handle what was happening. Amanda tried calling again, then texting. Just one line at first. "Can we talk?" Then another a few days later. "I really need to speak with you." And then silence again, like she wasn't even sure I was reading them. Like she was unsure if her voice still had a place in my world. I didn't reply, not because I hated her, not because I wanted her to suffer, but because I needed her to understand the weight of silence. I needed her to feel the void she helped create, because the night she watched Chad humiliate me and said nothing, something in me cracked too deep to fix with a voicemail. Still, I drove by the building sometimes, late at night when the streets were quiet and the city felt like it had softened its breath. I parked across the street and watched the light in their window flicker like a dying heartbeat. Sometimes I saw Amanda pacing, her shadow cast long and tired against the curtain. Sometimes I saw Chad yelling, gesturing with a beer can in hand, the silhouette of someone who had lost control but still clung to the illusion of it. And part of me still hurt like hell. Because even now, even knowing everything, Even holding the deed to the building that once cast me out, I would have given anything to be invited back in. Not to the apartment, but to her heart. But I knew that wasn't possible. Not yet. So I waited, and I watched, because sometimes the most powerful justice is the one that doesn't say a word. I saw her again at the grocery store about 3 weeks after the rent notice went out. I didn't plan it. I was just passing through, picking up coffee and bananas. Something simple, something normal. But then I saw her 2 aisles over, standing behind a cart that looked half empty. Her hair was pulled back the way she used to wear it when she'd been crying, rushed and uneven, and the way she kept looking at her phone told me all I needed to know. She stood there staring at a box of mac and cheese, the cheap kind, the kind I used to buy in bulk when she was little and begged for orange noodles after school. She looked down at her phone again, then back at the box, then slowly placed it back on the shelf. Like even that felt like too much. I should have walked away. I didn't. I followed her quietly, watching from a distance, my heart pounding like I was doing something wrong, like I was stealing pieces of a life that no longer belonged to me. But the truth was, I couldn't stop looking because what I saw wasn't Amanda the grown woman. It was Amanda, the little girl. The one who ran to me crying when she scraped her knee. The one who asked me to check under her bed for monsters, and now she was living with one. When I got home that day, I sat on the couch and stared at the wall for what felt like hours. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just held my breath and let the weight of everything sit on my chest like a stone. But I reminded myself again, this wasn't punishment. This was consequence. And consequence was long overdue. I began making more changes to the building, small ones at first, repairs that Chad had ignored for years, broken door locks, hallway lights that buzzed like flies, leaky faucets, the things that tenants complained about but never had fixed because Chad said it wasn't in the budget. Now it was in the budget. Because the budget was him. He started sending messages through the tenant portal, long and angry and full of entitlement. He called the increase, extortion, and the repairs a joke and demanded to speak to the owner. The irony of it all made me smile quietly to myself. He didn't know the owner was the woman he kicked out without hesitation. He didn't know the upgrades were paid with the money he now resented parting with every month, and I had no intention of revealing myself. Not yet, because the longer he screamed into the void, the more I could see him unravel. He left passive-aggressive notes under the management office door, scribbled in messy handwriting, full of demands and veiled threats. Amanda stopped leaving voicemails and switched to texts again, short, hesitant. Hey, then days later, I really need you. Then nothing again. Meanwhile, I reviewed the financial reports. ML Holdings was stable. The property was performing better than ever. The other tenants were happy, quiet, cooperative. Only Chad made noise, and Amanda was caught in the middle of a storm she had helped create, and I was watching from above, literally. My new apartment overlooked their courtyard. Different building. Higher floor. Safer neighborhood, a view they could never afford, and I didn't watch them all the time, just enough to remind myself that I wasn't crazy, that I hadn't imagined the betrayal, that everything they did to me had finally come full circle. The knock came on a Sunday evening just after sunset, soft and slow, the kind that isn't urgent but isn't casual, either the kind that says, I have nowhere else to go. I opened the door, and Amanda stood there soaked from the rain, a grocery bag clutched to her chest, her hair dripping, her eyes swollen, her mouth open like she wanted to speak, but no words came out. Just silence. I stepped aside and she entered slowly, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to be here, like she was stepping onto ground that might collapse beneath her feet. I didn't say anything. I just handed her a towel and walked to the kitchen. The kettle was already warm and I poured 2 mugs of chamomile tea, the way I used to when she had nightmares as a child. She sat at the edge of the couch like she was visiting a stranger's home, her back stiff. Her fingers wrapped tightly around the mug like it might hold her together. He's not who I thought he was, she said. Finally, her voice cracking in a way that told me the words had been waiting a long time to escape. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I mean, I knew part of me always knew, but I told myself it was stress, that he just needed support, that if I was patient, he would change. Still, I said nothing, and she looked up. "He thinks someone's targeting us," she said. "He's obsessed. He's been going through my phone, through my email last week. He followed me to work, said he was making sure I wasn't hiding anything from him or protecting someone else." Then she looked at me eyes wide like she expected me to flinch. "He asked if you were behind it." She said, "I told him I didn't know where you were," but that was a lie. I met her gaze for the first time in months, and neither of us looked away. I found the building's name in a tenant notice. Same management company. I figured it out. She said it wasn't hard. Of course it wasn't. Amanda was many things, but never stupid, just blind, sometimes willfully. "So I miss you," she said, barely louder than a whisper. "But I don't know how to be around you anymore. You left and I let you." She continued. "I let him push you out, and I stood there and said nothing. I didn't correct her because she was wrong. You didn't let him," I said slowly. "You stood with him." That stopped her cold, and I saw the words hit like bricks behind her eyes. We sat in silence, two women connected by blood but divided by choices and regret. When she finally stood to leave, she looked smaller than I remembered. Like life had shaved down her edges, like she had become the ghost of the girl I used to know. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said. "I just needed to remember what it felt like to be safe." She turned to go, but then paused suddenly and wrapped her arms around me. I didn't hug back at first. Then I did slowly, gently, like someone trying to hold a memory without breaking it. When she pulled away, she didn't say goodbye, just looked at me one last time and walked out the door. The next day, I received an invitation notice for a tenants meeting, a routine announcement. But this one was different, because this time, the owner would be attending. Chad had been demanding answers, demanding names, demanding someone to blame, and now he would get one. I dressed in a charcoal blazer, dark jeans, hair softly curled, no jewelry, no fanfare, just simple, quiet power. The common room filled slowly. Amanda sat in the back. Chad stood by the door like a man preparing for war. When the manager announced the owner was here, I stood up and walked to the front. Every head turned, Chad's face twisted in confusion. Then rage. Amanda gasped softly like air had left the room. "Hello," I said. "My name is Margaret. I'm the owner of this building." The silence that followed could have shattered glass. Chad shot up from his seat, knocking the chair backward. "You," he yelled. "What kind of sick game is this?" I looked at him calmly. "This isn't a game, Chad. It's business. You raised our rent. You humiliated us," he shouted. "You planned this." "I didn't raise your rent," I said. "I brought it to market value. I treated every tenant the same. I just didn't forget what you did." He opened his mouth to yell again, but Amanda stood between us. "Chad, stop," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She turned to me. "I didn't know, I swear, about the building and the money, any of it. I know," I said gently. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Because you had to see it for yourself," I said. "Not just hear it, but feel it." Chad scoffed. "You two deserve each other." "No," I said. "She deserves better." And with that, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there with his fists clenched and his pride shattered. Amanda showed up at my door 4 days later, holding something that stopped me in my tracks. My mother's diary. "You left this last time," she said. "I read it. I wasn't trying to pry. I just needed something to make sense." I told her everything about Harold Sterling, about the inheritance, about the truth that had been hidden from me for decades. I didn't know how to fix what happened between us, but for the first time I saw in her eyes the girl I had raised, not the woman who abandoned me. She sat on the floor beside me, her head resting on my shoulder like she used to, and we just sat there. No apologies, no promises, just presence. Sometimes that's enough. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like an extra mouth to feed. I felt like a mother again. I didn't sell the building right away, even though I could have, even though the offers started coming in within weeks of the reveal. but I needed time not just to let go, but to understand what I was letting go of. Because it wasn't just brick and mortar. It was the place where I had once been discarded and then quietly returned, not to take revenge, but to reclaim space, to rewrite the ending they had tried to give me. But endings are a funny thing. They don't come with door slams or grand speeches. Sometimes they come with silence, sometimes they come with tea, and sometimes they come with the soft weight of your daughter's head on your shoulder as she finally remembers who you really are. I sold the building that spring on a quiet Tuesday morning, the paperwork signed in less than 15 minutes. No press, no noise, just a handshake and a simple transfer of power from one version of me to another. The money arrived the next day. I didn't throw a party. I wrote a check, a big one. Half the proceeds went to a local shelter for women and children in crisis, the kind of place I wished I had known about. The night I stood on the curb with 2 suitcases and nowhere to go, I asked them to use the funds to build a wing in my mother's name, the Eleanor House. Because she fought for me in silence, and now I was returning the favor. The other half I used it to buy a small home on a quiet street in Cedar Park, the same neighborhood I once left behind, filled with memories I thought would destroy me. Now I was building new ones there. The house wasn't fancy. 2 bedrooms, a front porch with a swing, oak trees that whispered when the wind passed through. It was enough. More than enough. Amanda helped me move in. She didn't talk much while we unpacked. Neither did I. But sometimes healing doesn't need words. Just presence. We made grilled cheese sandwiches that night, the way we used to when she was little. Burnt one side and laughed anyway. And for the first time in what felt like years, the laughter didn't hurt. It healed. She left after dinner, but not before hugging me long and tight and whispering, "I'm proud of you, Mom, and I'm sorry I didn't cry." Not then, but later. As I stood at the window with a cup of tea in both hands, watching the moonlight stretch across the lawn, I whispered the words I had been waiting to say for years. I forgive you. Not to Amanda. To myself, because the hardest part was never losing everything. It was believing I didn't deserve to find it again, and I did in the quiet, in the rebuilding, in the discovery of a truth that had been hidden but not lost. Because I was never lost, I was just underestimated. The woman they tried to erase became the name they couldn't forget. Not because I screamed, not because I fought, but because I rose, silently, steadily on my own terms. And when I opened my mother's diary one last time, I tucked a note inside for Amanda to find someday when she needed it most. It said, "You don't need their love to be worthy. You don't need their approval to be strong. You only need the truth, and to never ever forget who you are." The clock ticked softly behind me. My tea grew cold in my hands, but my heart, it was finally warm. And I was finally home. She was the woman they tossed aside like a broken chair. She was the mother they treated like a bill they didn't want to pay, and now she owns the roof over their heads and the keys to every locked door they once slammed shut in her face. But this wasn't revenge, it was justice. Not loud, not cruel, just quiet, precise, and deeply earned. And maybe you felt something while listening. Maybe you're angry, maybe you're heartbroken, or maybe, just maybe, you're remembering a moment when someone made you feel small. Let this story remind you, you are not invisible. You are not forgotten. You are not just an extra mouth to feed. You are power. You are legacy. You are enough. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Send it to someone who needs to hear it and never forget. Your silence doesn't make you weak. It makes you unstoppable. Until next time, be kind, be bold, and always choose truth over comfort.